My Monday morning had been cruising along as if it were scripted, until the sun finally emerged from a week of relentless drizzling over Portland. I, Vivian Carter, director of the Portland FBI field office, took pride in my punctual, efficient routine. My coffee was brewed to a precise, kickstart intensity, my blazer was pressed and my ankle boots polished. I was even a minute early. For someone who chased criminals on a daily basis, punctuality was my superpower. With a hint of mischief and the thrill of a rare day off, I changed into my new scarlet one-piece swimsuit, an ensemble that boldly declared both competence and style, and headed for my backyard pool. The water, a sparkling turquoise oasis surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and well-worn lounge chairs, promised a few blissful moments of solitude. I spread out my vibrant patterned towel, slathered on my SPF 50, because wrinkles, after all, are a sworn enemy, and eased myself into the cool, refreshing embrace of my personal retreat. For about 5 perfect minutes, I closed my eyes and floated, surrendering to the gentle, rhythmic lap of water. Then the peace was shattered by a shrill, escalating voice that cut through the hum of the pool filter. I peered over my oversized sunglasses and saw her, a vision of scorn and sourness, Valerie Warwick. Clad in a faded mint cardigan and sensible sneakers, Valerie was my neighbor from 2 houses down, notorious for her unwavering commitment to neighborhood decency. "You can't be serious," she shrieked, her voice echoing over the manicured hedges. "This is a private pool residence, and you, strutting around in that shocking swimsuit, are tarnishing the standards of our community." I blinked, caught between disbelief and indignation. "Valerie, I live here. This is my property," I replied coolly, trying to maintain composure despite the absurdity of the situation. Her face contorted as if she'd swallowed a sour lemon whole. "This is a family neighborhood. Children are present. Your audacity is simply unacceptable," she bellowed, her tone rising further with every word. I looked down at my pristine blazer and recalled how I'd built my reputation on calm professionalism. Yet here was Valerie, determined to assert her misguided authority. I sighed inwardly. I was a seasoned investigator and negotiator, yet I was now faced with an irrational demand to vacate my own pool. In that moment, I knew my quiet afternoon would not go unchallenged, and I braced myself for what was to come. Little did I know that this confrontation would ignite a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted insecurities and shake the very foundation of suburban decorum. The incident at my pool had ignited a spark that soon fanned into a full-blown conflagration of suburban absurdity. After Valerie Warwick's outrageous tirade, the previously placid vibe of my private backyard shifted into a tension-charged atmosphere. I returned to my refreshing swim, yet the sound of harsh words still echoed in my ears. Neighbors peered out from behind manicured hedges and pristine front lawns, whispering about the latest disruption. It seemed that what began as an isolated outburst by Valerie had become an unofficial spectacle in our neighborhood. No sooner had I resumed my swim than I noticed a clattering sound from the driveway, a low, dissonant rhythm of footsteps and a metal clatter that signaled something amiss. I lifted my head above the water, and there, striding with determined disapproval, was Derek Bennett, a lanky man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a reputation for scrutinizing anyone who dared disrupt his version of suburban perfection. Derek was a devoted enforcer of local standards, notorious for patrolling the block with a clipboard in hand. His presence, combined with the lingering memory of Valerie's outburst, made it clear that our little enclave had turned into a hive of self-appointed regulators. "Vivian, are you aware that your behavior has drawn unwarranted attention?" Derek demanded as he approached my gate. His voice held a mixture of concern and thinly veiled anger. I replied firmly, "I'm perfectly aware, and I assure you, this is my property, and I have every right to enjoy it." Derek's eyes narrowed, and he began to methodically jot down details about my attire and the state of my lawn, as though these minutiae were evidence of some great moral failing. Meanwhile, Valerie had not relented. From her perch on a faded lawn chair outside her own modest home, she continued to rail against what she deemed an affront to neighborhood dignity. Over the next hour, her tirade morphed from isolated insult into an ongoing spectacle. Every now and then, she was seen on the phone, apparently alerting someone. Perhaps the local HOA or even the police, of my misconduct. Her words grew harsher, laced with discriminatory undertones that shockingly revealed her deep-seated insecurities. I made several attempts to quiet the situation by addressing the disruptive behavior calmly. I explained to Derek and a handful of other onlookers that I was not flaunting any untoward display, that this was my private domain. But each time, Valerie would interject with shrill exclamations about maintaining high standards, insinuating that my relaxed lifestyle was somehow lowering property values. Her rhetoric wasn't just about pool etiquette, it was a declaration of war on everyone who didn't conform to her narrow worldview. Inside my head, my irritation simmered. I'd built my career on disarming international threats and handling crises with a cool head, but facing petty, garden-variety prejudice right at home was something entirely different. With every unanswered query from Derek's clipboard and every demeaning shout from Valerie, it became apparent that the enforcement of these arbitrary rules had escalated beyond mere neighborhood gossip. I could almost sense the collective heartbeat of Crestview Glade quickening in discomfort. Even those who usually kept their heads down were now openly exchanging disapproving glances. That evening, after most of the neighbors had reluctantly dispersed, I took it upon myself to document every detail of the day's ordeal. I recorded snippets of conversations, snapped photos of Valerie's furious face, and even noted the number of times she mentioned property values in her tirade. My goal was clear: to capture the absurdity and to build a case, if necessary, to challenge the overzealous enforcement that was slowly encroaching on our freedoms. As dusk settled over Crestview Glade, the once peaceful neighborhood now thrummed with a sense of impending change. I knew this wasn't just a simple dispute over a pool, it was a microcosm of a much larger struggle against irrational prejudice and uninformed regulation. The battle lines had been drawn, and I vowed that, come what may, I would defend my right to enjoy my own space with dignity. I stepped back into the cool, soothing water, determined to let the pool's tranquil embrace wash away the day's indignity even as I prepared for what would come next. In Part 3, the narrative shifts as the focus turns to the bizarre mechanisms of neighborhood regulation that have encroached on my life. For this section, I will change some of the key nouns and descriptive phrases while keeping our character names, Vivian Carter and Valerie Warwick, consistent. Every day seemed to bring a fresh reminder that the rigid enforcement of suburban etiquette in Crestview Glade was less about safety and more about control. My detailed log, what I'd come to refer to internally as the Glade Chronicle, had reached a point where every recording of intrusive patrols, unsolicited memos, and petty accusations painted a damning picture of authoritarian overreach in our once friendly community. Early one morning, after completing another grueling day in the office, I returned home to find that the tension from the previous day had only worsened. Instead of the gentle hum of everyday suburbia, there was now an unmistakable buzz of anxiety in the air. I noticed that the manicured lawns looked even more pristine than usual, almost as if the residents were trying too hard to hide behind perfection. It's as if our entire neighborhood has been placed under a microscope, I muttered to myself. At exactly 7:45 a.m., I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching my front gate. It was Derek Bennett again, clipboard clutched tight, his eyes focused in a manner that made it clear he was on a mission. He began asking pointed questions about my daily routine, the exact time I left for work, and even the color of the flowers in my garden. The questions, trivial as they were, felt designed to strip away my privacy. I recorded the exchange on my phone, not because I intended to share it, but to have evidence of the absurdity of this surveillance. Derek's tone was clinical, his inquiries methodical, yet there was an underlying air of menace that made me uneasy. It was as though every moment of my life was being measured against an impossible standard of propriety, one that only people like Valerie Warwick seemed to enforce. Valerie's influence extended far beyond her own front yard. I began noticing that others in the neighborhood were adapting to her style. Conversations turned tense, the usual casual greetings were replaced by furtive glances and whispered caution. At the local coffee shop, I overheard a group of residents discussing how they felt as if they were living in a perpetual state of surveillance. Nothing was private anymore. I even miss being able to leave my car parked on the street without someone tapping on my window," one of them said, shaking his head. I also discovered that Valerie was making systematic rounds, her presence so ubiquitous that it seemed as though she had installed cameras in every mailbox and front door. I wasn't sure if she was acting alone or if the local HOA had secretly sanctioned her actions, but the effect was the same, a stifling atmosphere of conformity and fear. That night, I sat by my desk and painstakingly compiled every incident into the Glade Chronicle. I noted every unwarranted question, every suspicious glance, every memo that had appeared on our community boards like an unwanted scar. Every entry was a stark reminder that this was no longer an issue of neighborly concern. It had become a siege on personal liberty. In the soft glow of my desk lamp, I resolved that this record would serve as ammunition for a future challenge, a challenge to reclaim our community's right to privacy and individuality. The systematic questioning, the relentless enforcement of trivial rules, it all had to come to an end. I promised myself that I would not allow these invasive practices to define our lives in Crestview Glade. For now, though, I decided to take solace in the small freedoms that remained. I turned on a recording device and read aloud some of the entries from my log, letting my voice carry the absurdity of it all into the quiet night. Every recorded detail was a testament to the extreme measures that had been imposed on us, and it galvanized me with a quiet resolve. In the face of such relentless scrutiny, I would not back down. Tomorrow, I vowed, I would push back. Armed with evidence, with the collective strength of my neighbors, and with an unyielding commitment to truth. The mounting pressure and invasive oversight that had become the norm in Crestview Glade could no longer remain hidden behind closed doors. At a community forum convened in the refurbished town hall one balmy afternoon, residents gathered to voice their frustrations about the ever-tightening surveillance and arbitrary rule enforcement. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and simmering anger. I, Vivian Carter, attended the meeting, determined to speak on behalf of those whose privacy had been violated. As neighbors trickled in, some with hopeful expressions, others with grim resignation, I took my place at the front, my notes from the Glade Chronicle clutched tightly in hand. Before long, a hush fell over the assembly as one after another, residents recounted their grievances. An elderly gentleman lamented how even his attempt to water his azaleas had resulted in an unsolicited inspection, while a young couple tearfully described the mounting pressure on their children to conform to bizarre community standards. The recurring theme was clear: the rigid enforcement of minutiae had transformed our once vibrant neighborhood into a claustrophobic state of constant judgment. Just as the meeting reached a crescendo of shared indignation, Valerie Warwick stormed into the room. Clad in her usual array of austere hues and with her expression set in a permanent scowl, she declared, "We must not let disorder dictate our way of life. We must protect our community's integrity." Her voice rang out, echoing off the aged walls of the town hall. For a long moment, the room was split, some residents nodded, while others exchanged skeptical glances, remembering too well the petty tirades that had become Valerie's trademark. I rose and addressed the gathered crowd. Our home should be a sanctuary, not a surveillance state. We need balance, respect for individual freedoms alongside our shared responsibilities. The excess of this regime is not about protecting property values, it's about imposing arbitrary standards that serve no one. My words, calm and resolute, resonated with the assembly. A murmur of agreement swept through the room as more voices joined the call for reason. Some neighbors even expressed their desire to establish a resident committee to oversee how the rules were enforced, a democratic approach to community standards rather than the heavy-handed tactics currently in use. Valerie, not willing to relent, countered with a flurry of statistics and references to outdated neighborhood regulations. Yet as she spoke, her voice wavered under the collective strength of our unified sentiments. One by one, the residents recounted personal episodes of overreach, their voices becoming the heartbeat of a growing movement for change. Tensions reached a fever pitch when an impassioned young man, who had lost his sense of comfort in his own home, challenged Valerie directly, accusing her of being more interested in controlling appearances than in safeguarding actual safety. The room erupted in a mixture of applause, murmurs of approval, and even a few tears. In that charged moment, it became clear that the community was ready to reclaim its right to live without constant interference. I closed my presentation by urging that we demand transparency from the HOA board and an immediate review of enforcement policies. Let us not allow the tyranny of trivial rules to dictate our lives, I declared. Instead, let us shape our community based on fairness, empathy, and respect for our personal liberties. As the meeting adjourned, many residents lingered, sharing ideas and planning follow-up discussions. The tide had undoubtedly begun to turn. That day, I felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that even in a place once dominated by arbitrary control, the united voice of the people could spark lasting change. In the wake of our public outcry, I knew that our voices alone would not be enough to dismantle the oppressive practices ruling Crestview Glade. Concrete evidence was necessary to turn public sentiment into actionable change. Over the following days, I embarked on a meticulous mission to document every instance of invasive oversight and unwarranted intrusion, a project that would soon become known as the Glade Dossier. Late one evening, I sat at my desk surrounded by scattered notebooks, digital recordings, and countless photographs. I began by collecting images of anonymous memos pinned to community boards, each note laced with inflammatory language that disparaged residents for trivial infractions like improper pool decorum and unsuitable property aesthetics. These photographs, taken under the low glow of desk lamps, captured the hostile tone of a rule enforcement system gone mad. I then turned my attention to the digital realm. I downloaded screenshots of heated conversations from our local community forum, where residents, under pseudonyms, shared their personal accounts of being hounded by intrusive patrols and arbitrary fines. Every comment and every story added another layer to the burgeoning archive of evidence. I carefully labeled each file with the date and a brief description, determined that every detail would serve as an irrefutable record of the systemic overreach in our neighborhood. As I sifted through my collected data, I also reached out to neighbors who had been directly affected. Mrs. Ethel Johnson, a kindly widow known for her lovingly tended rose garden, recounted how she'd received a stern warning for letting a stray petal land on her walkway. A young father, Timothy Ruiz, tearfully admitted that his children were now hesitant to play outside, fearful of drawing the relentless gaze of the enforcers. Their testimonies, recorded either via voice memos or handwritten statements, were integrated carefully into the Glade Dossier. Additionally, I compiled data on the frequency of these intrusive actions. I noted down the time and date of each encounter with Officer Moore, the resident patrol who had become synonymous with our neighborhood's loss of privacy. I cross-referenced these recordings with the official HOA policies, highlighting glaring inconsistencies between the rules as intended and their actual application. The evidence built a clear, damning picture. Our community's rights were being systematically violated by the very institution meant to protect them. By the end of a long week, the Glade Dossier emerged as a comprehensive file organized into sections by date, incident type, and the responsible party. I created both digital copies and printed binders, ensuring that this record would be available for any formal review by the HOA board or relevant authorities. This dossier wasn't just a collection of grievances, it was a beacon of hope for every resident who yearned for a return to true privacy, dignity, and individuality. Late that night, as I secured the final documents in a locked filing cabinet, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. I knew that when the time came, this dossier would be our strongest weapon in demanding change, a demand for a transparent, empathetic, and community-oriented approach to rule enforcement in Crestview Glade. I resolved that I would present it at the next HOA meeting, confident that the undeniable evidence within would finally break the grip of oppressive oversight. With the Glade dossier in my possession, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction, aware that the struggle for our rights was far from over, but that we had taken a crucial step toward reclaiming the soul of our community. With the Glade dossier compiled and the mounting grievances of the residents firmly documented, I realized that our battle against the overreaching regime in Crestview Glade needed to expand beyond individual protest. It was time to galvanize our neighbors into a united front, a movement that would demand accountability and the restoration of our basic rights to privacy and personal freedom. One crisp evening, I convened a small, off-record meeting at the Silver Maple Café, a cozy spot known for its quiet corners and warm ambience. I personally invited a group of affected residents, Mr. Ronald Pierce, a soft-spoken retiree whose prized garden had been the subject of repeated, unsolicited inspections, Ms. Felicia Rhodes, a young mother who tearfully described how constant scrutiny had forced her children indoors, and a few others who had had enough of the invasive rule enforcement. In the softly lit back room of the café, we gathered around a worn wooden table. I began by presenting the Glade dossier, in a concise, compelling manner, reading aloud excerpts from the memos, displaying photographs of intrusive notices, and recounting testimony from our neighbors. Our community was built on trust and the freedom to live our lives without fear, I said. Yet, day after day, we are reduced to subjects of a surveillance regime that values trivial infractions over genuine human connection. The response was immediate and powerful. One by one, people shared their own stories of harassment. A neighbor who was reprimanded for leaving his car parked slightly askew, another who was chastised for an improper use of decorative garden ornaments. The room vibrated with a sense of shared frustration and, beneath it, a burgeoning hope that together, we might reclaim our dignity. I then proposed a plan, to draft a petition demanding a comprehensive review, and eventual reform of the HOA's enforcement protocols. We must not let arbitrary rules dictate our lives, I urged. Our home should be a place of refuge and individuality, not a prison of imposed conformity. With determination, we set to work. I drafted a succinct petition and we made copies to be distributed door to door throughout Crestview Glade. Over the next few days, I joined my neighbors on their rounds, personally soliciting signatures. Despite an initial hesitation among some residents, fearful of potential retaliation, the petition grew steadily in numbers. At the same time, I turned to our local online forum, posting an open letter that detailed our grievances and outlined our demands for a transparent and balanced system of neighborhood governance. The response was overwhelming. A surge of supportive comments and shared experiences quickly created a groundswell of collective activism under the hashtag #GladeFreedom. Our movement soon gathered momentum, and before long, a formal town hall meeting was arranged in the central park of Crestview Glade. On a mild, clear evening, a diverse crowd of residents assembled beneath the ancient oak trees. There, amid the rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of community voices, I presented the petition and shared the documented evidence from the Glade dossier. The public forum was an emotional catharsis. Residents spoke openly about the invasions of their privacy and the suffocating atmosphere imposed by the overly zealous enforcers. The spirited discussion reached a turning point when one of the attendees proposed the creation of a resident oversight committee, a body that would work collaboratively with the HOA board to ensure that enforcement was fair, humane, and transparent. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic applause, and several residents committed themselves to the cause, vowing to stand together against arbitrary tyranny. As the meeting drew to a close, the mood in the park was one of cautious optimism. We had taken our first decisive steps toward reclaiming the power that had long been usurped by an oppressive system. I left the gathering with a renewed sense of purpose and responsibility, a conviction that together, our collective voices could foster lasting change. That night, as I sat on my back porch under a starlit sky, I reflected on the events with a mixture of determination and hope. The fight for our rights was far from over, but through unity and perseverance, a new era of respectful governance in Crestview Glade was within reach. I resolved to continue the movement, to ensure that every resident was empowered and that our community could reclaim the freedom and individuality we once cherished. At last, the simmering tension in Crestview Glade reached its climax. After weeks of mounting frustrations and organized petition efforts, our collective determination demanded a direct confrontation with the face of authoritarian oversight. A public meeting was arranged at the community gazebo, a modest structure set in the heart of our neighborhood park, where residents had gathered to finally challenge the status quo. As the sun beamed down on that critical afternoon, I arrived at the gazebo amid a crowd of resolute faces. Neighbors from every corner of Crestview Glade had come forward, united by the shared indignity of intrusive enforcement and the promise of a fairer tomorrow. The atmosphere was a blend of quiet determination and palpable anger, a fusion of emotions that, as I soon found out, could be a powerful catalyst for change. At the forefront of the assembly stood Valerie Warwick, ever the self-appointed guardian of community standards. With her stern expression and an air of imperious authority, she took the podium with a voice that carried both certainty and a note of desperation. Our community cannot tolerate this abomination of constant surveillance and infringement upon personal freedoms, she declared, her words met with a mix of applause and murmurs of disapproval. I stood then, my heart steady but my resolve unyielding, and addressed the assembly. Fellow residents, our lives have been overrun by a trivial enforcement of rules that have nothing to do with community safety. What we're being forced to endure is not about protecting property values, it is about controlling our every move. I recounted in detail the intrusive patrols, the unwarranted memos, and the daily indignities inflicted by those charged with maintaining order. I referenced our collective petition and the evidence meticulously compiled in the Glade Chronicle, urging that we, as a community, reclaim our right to live freely and respectfully. The debate grew heated as one neighbor after another stepped forward with personal stories of being forced to alter natural behaviors, of having simple acts of joy turned into reasons for reprimand. The collective voice swelled into a resolute call for reform. Some clapped, some shouted in support, and even a few tearful admissions of long-standing fear punctuated the conversation. The energy in the gazebo was transformative, a moment when the oppressive forces that had long governed our lives were openly challenged. Valerie's retorts, though forceful, began to falter under the weight of irrefutable personal testimony and the burgeoning solidarity among the residents. I proposed the creation of a community oversight committee to act as an impartial bridge between the residents and the HOA board. A move that would ensure transparency and humaneness in rule enforcement. The suggestion was met with thunderous applause and overwhelming approval from the gathered crowd. As the meeting progressed, I observed a subtle but unmistakable change in the attitudes of many in attendance. The once overbearing air of control was giving way to hope. The community had awakened to the realization that their voices mattered, that they could effect change by uniting against arbitrary rule. Valerie's imposing figure, once the embodiment of suburban authoritarianism, now looked diminished before the collective will of her neighbors. By the end of the meeting, resolutions were proposed for policy reviews, and a sense of unity permeated the crowd. Although no sweeping reforms were immediately enacted that day, the event marked a turning point. I left the gazebo that afternoon with a deep sense of responsibility. Aware that our public outcry was only the beginning of a long journey toward reinstating fairness and dignity in Crestview Glade. As I walked home under a sky tinged with dusk, I felt a bittersweet mix of triumph and cautious optimism. The confrontation at the community gazebo had not solved every problem, but it had set the wheels of change in motion. Our shared determination and the collective evidence provided us with a foundation to challenge the oppressive status quo. I resolved that I would continue working alongside my neighbors to ensure that every resident's right to privacy and freedom was finally respected.